Welcome to News from Neptune for October 25th in the 43rd week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, said, quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. government propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in Karl Marx's sense in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky said in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a U.S. government censorship and torture edition of News from Neptune. I refer by the general title to the appalling hearing in London this week about Julian Assange, who is being tortured, literally, for his work with WikiLeaks by a vicious British government at the instructions of the U.S. government. While we've been talking about other things going on with Britain and indeed with the U.S. government this week, we've ignored this incredible case that is supported, unfortunately, the torture is supported by many leading American political figures, including our own U.S. Senator Durbin. This is a scandal, and it's a scandal we should be talking about, not the question of CIA whistleblowers and so forth, and the machinations of the Congress in regard to the president. There's a lot here, a lot of things to talk about, and I want to talk about that and some other things too. What's on your agenda, David?
Yeah, well, let me just first get this out of the way. The Illinois Green Party is having one of their biannual meetings tomorrow at the Illini Student Union on the third floor in 314. It goes all day, but for those who would just like to hear the more or less keynote speaker, that would be a fellow named Kevin Zeese, who is from the East Coast and talks about war and talks about health care. He will be talking more about foreign policy tomorrow at 4 p.m. in 314 Illini Union. He will also be, another speaker there will also be Professor Francis Boyle, fresh back from his defense of the plowshare, his unfortunately not successful defense of the Plowshares 7 in Georgia. So there's an earlier eco-socialism panel that's happening. You can look it up. I think it's around 2:30 or 3, or no, maybe that's at 1:30. That eco-socialism panel is like from 1:30 to 3. So you're welcome to spend your afternoon at the Green Party conference. There's no charge for being there, and I hope I will see a few people there. I will be there for the 4 p.m. session. Carl, I know you. I'm going to have to tamp myself down today. I know you're dealing with the truly important issues in terms of foreign policy and war and what's going on at this national level. And for some strange reason, I'm more upset by silly stuff that's going on at the local level, just because it's so silly and so stupid, but it gets under my skin. So in the spirit, I know you always like to tell the story about them having to peel Johnny Most off the ceiling of the Boston Garden after Havlicek stole the ball.
Your memory is fantastic.
Yeah, well, no, you've mentioned that more than once since I've known you. And
so is mine.
Yeah, I'm just saying that in the spirit of hoping that you won't have to peel me off the ceiling of UPTV studios after I deal with this issue, which is not nearly as important as Julian Assange or Syria or whatever, or Hillary Clinton's attacks on Tulsi Gabbard and so on and so forth. But I've been criticizing the U of I journalist, the News Gazette U of I journalist Julie Wirth, quite a bit on this program recently, and so why stop now? Because she produces something at least a couple times every week that just grinds my gears, as the current saying goes. The most recent one, not even the most recent, because this one this morning having to do with Illinois student government and the whole Israel anti-Semitism thing, I'm going to put that on the back burner. Jim Dye joins her in that category. This article is titled "Speakers Sexual Coercion," in single quotes, "Tip of the Iceberg. Policy Overhaul Must Consider Gender Harassment, They Say, at Special Summit." And the gist of this article is that a woman named Kate Clancy, who's an anthropology professor, has done a study, a quote-unquote national study of gender issues and sexual harassment in the STEM fields, or what sometimes they call the SEM fields, because they leave out the T for some reason. And yeah, maybe there's some problem with that letter T. I'm not sure, but and she is joined in this. Her there's many people involved in this study, as you would understand, in these sorts of things, by the National Academies for Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, in which they are concerned about the manner in which women are treated in the SEM or STEM fields. Her primary co-authors of this study were two other Illinois graduates, apparently, who are one of them's teaching at Michigan and the other somewhere else, or the other Connecticut. Anyway, the gist of this article is Clancy and two psychology professors refuted common myths and misperceptions, quote unquote, about sexual harassment Wednesday. This would have been, I think, a week ago Wednesday. Most people, quoting this article, by Julie Wirth, most people tend to think of sexual harassment as sexual coercion, quote unquote, making a job or educational opportunity contingent on sexual cooperation, i.e., quote unquote, sleep with me unless you're fired. Cortina, one of the last name of the woman, one of the other authors of this study, said. And then Wirth goes on, that's actually relatively rare, reported by about 1% of women in university studies, she said. More common is unwanted sexual attention, touching, hugging, groping, and the like, but those numbers are typically under 5%, she said. Most complaints fall under gender harassment, quote unquote, sexual or sexist remarks that convey hostility or second-class status to women. It's not about misplaced sexual desire, flirting, or romance gone awry, she said. It's about contempt. The National Academy's report refers to it as an iceberg, quote unquote, with sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention at the top, and everything else below the water, from obscene gestures to relentless pressure for dates to sexist comments such as, quote, women don't belong in science, unquote. But the research record is clear. More often than not, sexual harassment is a put down, not a come on. This co-author, Ms. Cortina, or Dr. or Professor Cortina said. Another myth, that the slights and indignities that denigrate women aren't as damaging as physical harassment. Studies show that's not true, she said. The National Academy report analyzed 88 studies involving 70,000 women for the impact of different types of harassment and found that gender harassment has at least as great an impact, if not greater, on personal and professional health as sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention, she said. I wrote a letter in response to this to the News Gazette, which should be appearing within the next week or so. So let me just read this straight without a whole lot of comment. This responds to speaker's sexual coercion tip of iceberg. Policy overhaul must consider gender harassment, they say at Special Summit by Julie Wirth. Wirth refers to UI anthropology professor Kate Clancy, who co-authored a national study on sexual harassment in STEM fields in higher education. This is all me speaking here, although I'm going to quote from this study. I have read this over 300-page study. It's not really 300 pages. There's always a lot of padding in these things. It's less than 100 page of not very difficult reading. I've read this over 300-page study. It is quite simply garbage in, garbage out. From the ridiculous sampling and survey methodologies to the opaque and dated literature review, to the overwrought generalizations and contrived language based on predetermined conclusions. And then I go on. To gaslight, quote unquote, is to, and I got this off, straightforward, right off the web, not that everything, whatever, is to gaslight is to manipulate someone by psychological means into questioning their own sanity, end quote. There is a problem, and this is me again, there is a problem in academia of male faculty sexually exploiting their authority over women with notable local examples. Instead of addressing this specific issue in terms of socioeconomic power and the dynamics of patriarchy, Clancy, this professor Kate Clancy, chooses to gaslight all males on this campus as being part of a sexist, quote-unquote, put-down culture. Her conclusions are false, lurid, and collectively slanderous. But they are supported by powerful and highly paid individuals wishing to deflect attention from actionable behavior among their own class of men. If campus climate, quote unquote, and this is the word that's used in this literature, if campus climate were as sexually and verbally abusive as Clancy claims, it would behoove Chancellor Jones, that's Robert Jones, to immediately suspend business as usual and hold intensive, mandatory sensitivity training and interpersonal truth-telling workshops for at least a solid week in every office, classroom, and laboratory on this campus. Moreover, he would be compelled to restrain his grandiose rhetoric about this institution. But, and I say in conclusion, but he won't, because he knows that this summit, quote unquote, was just part of what I ended up writing in this letter was this summit is just part of a sort of PR campaign and basically propaganda. And why am I being so hard on Professor Clancy? What is it that's what is it that's grinding my gears so much? As I said, these studies are poorly done. This is not social science. There is no sampling techniques which helps them to understand. They use something called convenient sampling, meaning anybody the 10 or 20% of people who take a survey are reputed to be representative of the population. They claim in the studies that they have to be careful with such samples, but they have to be more than careful because they're pretty worthless. And I guess the other general thing I would say about this is that look around you. Look at they have been having sexual harassment workshops and mandatory training on this campus, and I presume every other campus in this country, for at least 10 years or 15 years. I went to one myself. Carl, I have a feeling you probably went to one yourself.
I'm too old and too married.
Okay. You would be required to, however old and married you may have been.
Too retired, probably.
You would be required to if you were married once, twice, whatever. But whatever. What they're basically saying is, in the year of our Lord 2019, we just haven't made any progress. Because it really isn't sexual harassment that was the problem. It's put-downs. We have to stop the put-downs. I think it's nonsense. I don't think they have the data to show this. And I think commonsensically it's just nonsense, because anybody who's around people these days knows, A, that social life has always been complicated. The social life in the workplace is complicated. Stuff happens. Sexual harassment happens. But every time the two people have conflict, and every time a man and a woman have conflict, it doesn't involve gender. It may just involve personality. And, of course, such conflict can be put-downs of men by women, maybe not as much as women by men. I would like to see actual examples, as I wrote to Julie Wirth, and she responded to me, to her credit, although she didn't really convince me of anything. I would like to see where are the stories of women on this campus who feel that their life is just hell because of their gender. I don't buy it. I'll be happy to peel myself off the ceiling and roll into a little contrite ball if I can see some data that actually shows that is the problem that they say it is. But of course, it's not, because they got it. They're the ones who have to keep the ball rolling in terms of identity politics on this campus.
Calling on the chancellor of the university to deal with sexism in this fashion is perhaps a bit complicated for him right now, since he's so busy with anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism, right? Yes. Well, that's my other thing, but we'll put that off until later.
Perhaps we should mention that. I've got another attack on the News Gazette coming up, so maybe we should go ahead and talk about the university and anti-Semitism as well.
It was gutsy of you to write a letter so directly criticizing the regular column of a salute to those who served. It was direct, straight to the point, and I'm sure that for the next 2 weeks, the News Gazette letters column will be preoccupied by those responding to you. I could be wrong.
I welcome their hatred, as someone said, right?
Did George Carlin say that too? Or?
No. George Carlin, the political guru of the last generation.
I just want to say one more thing. I mean, I'm a parent of a 32-year-old son who went to school, high school, uni high, the University of Illinois, this campus. I mean, I know him, I know his friends, I know the atmosphere, I know stuff happens, but I'm sorry, let's give ourselves a pat on the shoulder. We raised some young men and women who know how to treat each other. It just couldn't be this bad. It just couldn't be anywhere near this bad. I don't think so.
You're watching News from Neptune. We've been talking about some local issues here. Local issues which, as David points out, are hardly limited to the local scene, but the particular attention to them in the local media is what prompts our reflections today. Continuing that vein, I will mention the note that I sent to the News Gazette this week Because it refers to the much broader and more important question of what the United States is doing in world politics, and particularly in terms of the foreign policy that has strangely faded into the background as the government and the media consider the peculiar activities of the current chief executive. As David mentioned, I was writing about the series that the News Gazette has been running for a while called Those Who Served.
Probably 3 or 4 years by now.
Exactly, yes. It's quite a long running.
Every Monday.
When the News Gazette actually was under a different ownership, we might say, too, or at least departing ownership. In any case, this has been a series of interviews and accounts of the experiences of local people in the American military, going back to World War II and up through the Vietnam years, as they say, and down through the Iraq years. The great international crimes that the U.S. has committed in the current generation are reflected on by the people who participated in them. Those Who Served is a laudatory account of the actions of American veterans. I observed to the News Gazette that those attending to the News Gazette's feature, Those Who Served, should recall the remark by the late George Carlin that, quote, "Service is a funny name for killing people." Since 1945, the United States government has killed over 20 million people in wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Latin America, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic hegemony that the U.S. inherited as the only largely undamaged major country in World War II. Russia lost some 27 million people in defeating Nazism. The U.S. lost 500,000 in World War II as a whole. To counter the vast American government propaganda on its role in killing people for the benefit of the U.S. 1%, I suggest beginning with Nicholson Baker's 2008 book, Human Smoke, The Beginnings of World War II, The End of Civilization, close quote. The title of the book is a remarkable piece of work that draws on the real political reporting of the 20th century in the run-up to the Second World War, and gives a very different picture of what that Second World War was about, what the sources and outcomes were, in contrast with the history, in inverted commas, that we've all been taught. That history is extremely important. The history that we carry around that justifies what the U.S. does, the U.S. government does, and what it is doing is vital. And to counter that, to question that, to open that up is rarely done in our general discussion. The great example of how to do that, it comes from fantasy literature. George Orwell's 1984. The ability to say the account that you've been given that justifies the behavior of governments, particularly the United States government, is false and corrupted, and it needs to be corrected. And if we're going to understand such things as the vast numbers of people the U.S. government is killing around the world today, we need to understand the lies that we've been told all along. And that's something that Those Who Served, as the feature is called in the News Gazette, should be doing. Some people are. A remarkable article, which I'll post on the website from the Facebook page, rather, of News from Neptune, by a military veteran, Danny Shershin, is an account of the sorts of understandings of the current military involvements of the United States that is common amongst the American military, not the top rank. Not the people like Admiral William McRaven, who called for nothing less than a coup against the sitting president in the New York Times this week, but the real views of contemporary military figures are the subject of Sturgeon's accounts. I recommend it highly, and as I say, we'll have at least one of his most recent articles on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. The discussion is one we should be having rather than a discussion about the peccadillos of the President of the United States. And unfortunately, we're not having that discussion.
I would just interject that at the most fundamental level, we're talking about wars that are never the result of one set of ideas versus another set of ideas, or one set of ideas about government or freedom or the meaning of life, or religion for that matter, versus another set of ideas. Wars are always about resources. They're always about material resources. They're always about the control of wealth and power and the ability to use power to extract resources. And the longer we get away from any set of wars, the more clear that becomes, because people aren't necessarily invested anymore in thinking that the 100 Years' War in the 14th century was fought because the British, or the English at that time, had different ideas than the French had. They had different material interests. And that is even clear when we look, even if we go back to, say, the Spanish-American War in 1898, especially in relation to Asia. I mean, it's pretty clear, even in high school history textbooks, the only reason that the U.S. was over there because it wanted to get its foot into the Asian markets, into especially the Chinese markets, like all the European countries were doing. Nobody. It's assumed in the context of a U.S. high school history textbook that we're just doing what's good and right and fighting for freedom, in this case, free markets, quote unquote. But it's pretty clear that we were only over there for economic, capitalist reasons, not for any other reasons. But it takes 100 or so years when nobody necessarily has a dog in that fight in the way they do, in the way some people still do in relation to Vietnam, and obviously the way they still do in relation to the Middle East, and of course World War II is the primary culprit in persuading people, in relation to fascism and communism and liberal democratic countries, that somehow this was a war over which ideas would rule the world, and it wasn't. It was a war over which country would use its military might to control global resources, which the U.S. has ever since.
The attempt by some people to correct the record, we're not talking simply about an historical record. We're talking about, as David suggests, a popular understanding that supports these war crimes by the United States government. There are many examples of attempts to challenge that, the most notable one in recent years being Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. But there are other things like that as well that you probably will not find in a high school curriculum, as you will not find Zinn in almost all, I would think, high school curricula. The task of correcting the American consciousness on this matter, it's been corrupted not by accident, as David suggests, but quite consciously. The task of correcting that is one we should take on seriously. I mentioned Danny Jurgen the other day, or a few minutes ago, and he wrote a column the other day in which he talked about the way in which this consciousness is played out in the U.S. Congress. You may recall from your high school history or whatever that Congress is supposed to declare war when the U.S. goes to war, but we haven't taken that very seriously recently.
First I've heard of it.
Shurshins writes, "We're through the looking glass, Alice. For years now I've lambasted the U.S. Congress for shirking its constitutionally mandated duty to actually declare and oversee America's wars. Now, in a cruel joke of sorts, it has finally decided to do so, symbolically voting to condemn the president for pulling troops out of a Syrian war it never sanctioned in the first place. In a rare bipartisan vote 2 weeks ago, the House overwhelmingly approved H.J. House Joint Resolution 77, quote, opposing the decision to end certain United States efforts to prevent Turkish military operations against Syrian Kurdish forces in northeast Syria." That's the title of the resolution our Congress voted on week before last. If ever proof was needed that Congress is inextricably linked to the military-industrial complex and the forever warfare state, it'd have to be this bill. It demonstrates the people's representatives in Washington, normally asleep at the war-making wheel, will only weigh in to continue the nation's endless wars. Their hypocrisy, it seems, knows no bounds. When a president, Obama in this case, unilaterally sent American soldiers to combat in a new theater, that is Syria, Congress looked the other way. The same was true in Yemen, Libya, Iraq 3.0, and across West Africa. However, should a president, Trump in this case, dare try end one of the plethora of endless wars, well, that same Congress will assert itself in a New York minute. The lesson true anti-war activists now know once and for all, not to look to Capitol Hill for salvation, ever. Nevertheless, this vote was historic and instructive, worthy of a far more detailed analysis than any mainstream media outlet has dared attempt. First of all, it passed by a landslide, 354 to 60. That was the vote in the House of Representatives on this joint resolution. Remarkably, a majority of both Democrats and Republicans voted for it, proving that forever war is the only truly bipartisan issue in tribally divided Washington. Furthermore, not a single Democrat opposed the legislation. Yet another demonstration of the stark reality that this is about Donald Trump at its root, and the Democrats can't claim any sort of anti-war bona fides. Even three-quarters of the squad of celebrity progressive Democrats, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, voted to prolong the U.S. military deployment in the Syrian civil war. Representative Ilhan Omar didn't vote against it, but didn't vote. A rather abrupt about-face from their normally sensible anti-war rhetoric, the so-called squad. I suppose even they bowed to Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the hyper-interventionist mainstream of the Democratic Party that veritably defines itself in opposition to Trump. And yet another baffling turnaround, all 60 of the representatives that stood by the president's admittedly imperfect attempt to end an unsanctioned and thus illegal war were Republicans. Sure, they were most likely motivated by loyalty to the president, but this still illustrates that the old rules of the game, where Democrats are the at least vaguely anti-war party, no longer apply. One thing remains constant, however. Congress, at least since the end of the Second World War, overwhelmingly tends to roll over and support ill-advised presidential war-making, even under false pretenses. After all, the House voted 414 to nothing, no one, to support President Lyndon Johnson's 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution that essentially greenlighted America's tragic war in Vietnam. And this week, in a particularly bizarre and ahistoric analogy, Obama's former national security advisor, Susan Rice, claimed that the decision to pull a handful of troops out of northeast Syria constituted, quote, Trump's Saigon, close quote. Yes, Susan, and like failed American intervention in South Vietnam, the war in Syria was from the start illegal, unsanctioned, and unwinnable. No matter, no one in the corporate media bothered to critique Rice's absurd and uninformed assertion. That's because she's one of them, a polite, respectable Washington war hawk in the most classic sense. Democrat, national security advisor. Just as predictably, no one in the mainstream press, and hardly anyone in Congress, questioned the wisdom or practicality of indefinitely securing and protecting a Kurdish mini-state in northeast Syria, or whether that was really Washington's motive in the first place. No crocodile tears for the Kurds was and is nothing more than a convenient tool to maintain perpetual military presence in an Arab state and bash Trump's foreign policy. And this is the case when we understand what America is doing, regardless of the quite serious things that have been written about the social experiments that were going on in the Kurdish areas of northeast Syria, attractive in their way. And that's being used also by some people to justify the American policy in the region. Here, too, all sense of historical context was absent. In an exasperated note this week, my former interpreter in Iraq, the author of this piece is a military officer, a retired military officer who served, in quotes, in Iraq.
There you go again.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the language is corrupted, yes. And we're caught by it. And in his case, he understood what he was doing, of course, as service, and now understands better, perhaps, what that service was. He's referring here to a note he had this week from his former interpreter in Iraq. He was an Army major in Iraq, a holder of 2 relevant master's degrees, who now drives a truck in New York City. This is an Iraqi who's worked for the American Army in Iraq and has now, wisely perhaps, come to the United States, has 2 master's degree, and has found gainful employment in the U.S. by driving a truck. A note from him to the author of this piece reminded me that the U.S. has a long history of supporting ethnic and religious minority separatism in the Arab world. As such, Uncle Sam has backed Jewish Israelis, Lebanese Christians, and now the Kurds in order to maintain a military foothold in the Middle East. Now, that point was notably absent in the discussions of Trump's, in quotes, betrayal, close quote, of the Kurds this week. And to put it back into that context is to try to understand what the U.S. is actually doing in the region and what the attempt to continue the war in Syria, illegal from the start, was about, and in both recent administrations. So the vote in Congress, which passed perhaps without much notice in America at all, while the pro-war press, notably the New York Times and Washington Post, were telling us about the sufferings of the Kurds, which were legitimate, and the nefarious activity of the American government in not continuing the situation of war and intervention in Syria begun by the last administration, and how shameful the actions of the current administration are. So it seems to me that what's important here, and the reason that this vital piece by a former American officer should be attended to, is that the actual policy of the United States, which, as David suggested a moment ago, goes back literally a century and more, should be noted, and the real causes of the crimes that the U.S. is committing around the world are not the peculiarities of a given president, but rather a constant example of what the U.S. has done there and elsewhere, and that's indeed what we should be talking about. But of course, that discussion is suppressed by by control of the American media, and you haven't heard much about it.
None of this should be to downgrade or denigrate the efforts of the Syrian Kurds to defend themselves against the other Muslim Salafist groups or ISIS, or their efforts to establish democratic forms of government and democratic forms of self-protection in this context. Also, on a different note, you would also want to mention, I mean, there's many groups you can mention in terms of this idea of supporting minority or sectarian groups. One would, but the most notable, I think, in terms of the Middle East, would be U.S. support for the Muslim Brotherhood in various contexts. And even in that context, I would note Israel's support, Israel's long-term historical sort of integration of the Druze minority population within Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It's a long story, but this tactic is tried and true.
And it's also important, I think, to understand that when the discussion begins with a lack of awareness of what the United States has actually done and in its constant policy in the Middle East, then the local questions become distorted. The question of the Kurds is almost, if it weren't for the massive death that's involved by American policy, would be almost funny, because the constant betrayal of the Kurds, when the Kurds no longer serve the long-term political processes of political interests of the United States, is quite remarkable. That's been noted by no less an observer than Henry Kissinger, who, when talking to a congressional committee years ago about an earlier betrayal of Kurds, was gave the response, we shouldn't confuse foreign policy with missionary work. Missionary work being support for the peoples that we're actually using to kill others in order to promote American policy in the region. Kissinger, whatever else he was clear-sighted about the crimes that the United States was committing and the reason for them.
That's called realism in foreign policy.
Well, not a bad idea in general.
Realism isn't about everything that's real, though, is it?
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a good number of things to talk about today. You want to play a card?
So, Jim Dye, from the other day, subtitle, in addressing anti-Semitism issue, Jones becomes issue in relation to Chancellor Jones. If University of Illinois Chancellor Robert Jones thought he was going to pour a reassuring rhetorical balm on the troubled waters of relations between Israel and Palestinians and Jewish and Palestinian students, he couldn't have been more wrong. Now he's getting it from all sides, poor Robert Jones. That will teach him to take his mind off, however briefly, the long-retired Chief Elinowik. It also ought to remind him of the consequences of getting in the middle of heated political disputes he can't resolve. Jones jumped feet first into the controversy with an October 9th email condemning allegedly anti-Semitic expressions that grew out of a presentation of Residence Hall advisors. The presentation was one of those adventures in multiculturalism that is supposed to be inclusive, making people feel all warm and fuzzy, but ends up causing a pointless fuss. Because my comments, multiculturalism isn't about telling the truth. It's about making people feel good about themselves. And what the pro-Palestinian students, the Students for Justice in Palestine students, did at this meeting was say some true things about the relative power relationships between the nuclear weaponed Israelis versus the stateless Palestinians. titled Palestine, and Dye goes on, titled, quote, Palestine in the Great Return March, Palestinian Resistance to 70 Years of Israeli Terror, end quote. It suggests an uncompromising point of view. It also presents a truth. It also, in my opinion, suggests a relatively truthful and straightforward point of view. Dye goes on. The student speaker may have thought the political point of view expressed was valid. It was valid, but others disagreed, perceiving it in an anti-Semitic slant. It's kind of awkward use of words. Jim Dye goes on, is that in any way surprising? Of course it's not, but that doesn't explain why you can't say true things about Israel and Palestine in a meeting that's under multicultural auspices. Dye goes on. Word eventually bubbled up to Jones, who addressed the issue in an October 9th email in which he asserted that, quote, some things that were said were highly inappropriate and created an unsafe environment, end quote. Dye goes on. Note in his use of the word unsafe. It's big under the campus bubble. And Dye is right about that. He's right to be critical of that, although his view is jaundiced in many other ways. Dye goes on. People on all sides of campus issues routinely claim that exposure to words or points of view they do not share make them, quote unquote, unsafe. He's right about that. And it's silly. Not the whole unsafe thing is silly. One thing is clear, Dye goes on, when everyone claims to be unsafe in a campus debate of this sort, it's highly likely that no one is in any danger. Unsafe is just another buzzword in the campus lexicon what one side invokes, in this case all sides, to silence the other. I don't think the Palestinians were trying to silence the pro-Palestinian students were trying to silence Israeli students. I think it's vice versa, and it's one-sided in that sense, just like the Israel-Palestine conflict is one-sided. Jim Dye, he resorts to both-sidism in this complaint.
As a friend of ours says.
The dreaded both-sidism. But in this case, it's true. It is both-sidism. It's because Jim Dye can't really look at he can't handle the truth about Israel and Palestine. At any rate, and he goes on, at any rate, complaints escalated in October 14th faculty meeting where various speakers told Jones that he should send out a new email saying what they would have said, meaning these faculty members.
Right.
Then members of a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. I'm not so why he says a group called. SJP has been around for a long time now, just like you would say a group called AAUP, Then members of a group called Students for Justice in Palestine protested at the homecoming parade. I'm not a big fan of that, but whatever. They chanted, hey, hey, ho, ho, Chancellor Jones has got to go. I'm not a big fan of that either. Dye goes on, they complained that he misrepresented anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, which Jones most certainly did.
Exactly.
They issued a series of the pro-Palestinian students, the SJP students, issued a series of non-negotiable demands that include retraction of his email, that's a good demand, opening up a cultural center for Middle Eastern North African students. Not a good demand because I'm sick of cultural centers and it doesn't mean anything, and that's not what they should care about. And hiring Palestinian faculty members, and then Dye snarkily includes, is Stephen Saleta available?
Yes.
And in fact, Stephen Saleta should be available.
Yeah, he should indeed.
And he has a lot to say about multiculturalism exactly in this context, which is why he doesn't like it. And so you can read those excerpts in an article I wrote on Mondoweiss back in the day, 2014, I think it was, which was some excerpts from his book Israel's Dead Soul. And then the SJP went on, quoted by Jai, failure to comply with the above demands will result in students' demand for the resignation of Chancellor Jones from his office, the group stated. And yes, this is a bit of silliness by the SJP students. They're being intersectional. They're being whatever. they're being tougher than they really are. But that's because they don't really diagnose what the nature of this multicultural thing is. They don't really diagnose what the nature of identity politics is, and how the pro-Palestinian movement has allowed itself to get mixed up in this identity politics business. That's my view. And then Dye goes on, there should be more fireworks today, the day that this was published. That's when members of the Illinois student government are scheduled to vote on a resolution condemning Jones and company for their, quote, ignorance of racism and equating Zionism with anti-Semitism, which they darn well should. Authors of this, Dye goes on, yeah.
That last darn well should is your interjection, not...
Right. Is my view.
Keep the
I know. I keep
contestants
myself
clear.
sorted out from.
Right.
I don't want people to confuse me with Jim Dye.
Yeah, I knew you didn't.
Dye goes on. Authors of the student resolution almost surely know best, but Jones, and that he concedes that to them. Good for you, Jim. But Jones just might be more conversant with racism than they wish to acknowledge. At any rate, authors of the resolution have taken a courageous stand of expressing their opposition to, quote, acts of injustice, unquote, and their criticism of the UI administration is, withering. They say administrators have, quote, created space for Holocaust deniers, Nazis, and other individuals, end quote, and responded with empty words to hateful events and have a history of equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So Dye is kind of, because it's so obvious that the chancellor is, basically repressing freedom of speech and conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and however biased Jim Dye is towards the Zionist point of view, he can actually see that. And then he concludes in this article, as a consequence, the resolution states Jones must retract and apologize for his email. And then Dye concludes in this waffly way. There are, of course, two sides to this Israeli terror debate. Yeah, there are two sides. One is right, one is wrong. That's my comment. Yeah. And Jewish students and their supporters will be lobbying against passage of this resolution. Not Jewish students, some Jewish students. So what's really on display here? In politics, two sides slugging it out over issues in which they vehemently disagree. Well, that trivializes it. There's a lot of issues unfolding here in relation to identity politics, in relation to intersectionality on campus, in relation to an institutional environment in which the truth cannot be told. I'll let you get in a word edgewise.
And we would also, of course, let our friend Jim Dye comment anytime he wants to, because I think...
That would be so much fun.
I think, exactly.
It's kind of a small table, but,
right.
Maybe we could lose some weight and fit him in here.
But the real issues on this are serious indeed, and it's important that they be discussed rather than suppressed, and that's what we're talking about. Julian Assange hearing in London's Westminster Magistrates Court on Monday was a despicable show trial. Assange, of course, is the head of WikiLeaks, who's been imprisoned by the U.S. And its running dog, British government, for a good while now. Any pretense that this was somehow a legal proceeding aiming to enforce the law and respect the rights of the accused has been abandoned. Assange, who defied the most powerful governments by revealing to the world's people war crimes and corruption, appeared gaunt and tormented by what a leading UN expert has described as torture. Craig Murray, a former British diplomat and current human rights activist, wrote that he was, quote, shocked by just how much weight my friend has lost. And this is Craig Murray, the British diplomat, referring to Assange, by the speed his hair has receded and by the appearance of premature and vastly accelerated aging. He has a pronounced limp I've never seen before. Since his arrest, he's lost over 15 kilograms in weight, close quote. Murray stated that Assange's physical appearance was not as shocking as his mental deterioration. When asked to give his name and date of birth, he struggled visibly over several seconds to recall both. This is a result of his torture, quite literally, in the British prison. In a grave warning, Murray wrote, "Everybody in that court yesterday saw that one of the greatest journalists and most important dissidents of our times is being tortured to death by the state before our eyes." And the state here, of course, is the U.S. and the U.K. With all the vindictiveness of the British ruling elite, presiding Judge Vanessa Barretzer did not even attempt to conceal her hostility to Assange, his legal team, and his supporters. Barretzer waved away arguments from Assange's lawyers, which should have resulted in the immediate dismissal of proceedings for his extradition from Britain to the U.S. and his release from prison. These included the fact that existing treaties explicitly banned extradition from Britain to the U.S. on political offenses, and that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency had conducted illegal spying against Assange while he was being protected by political asylum in Ecuador's London embassy. The surveillance included audio and video recordings of Assange confidential meetings and the theft of his legal documents. Far from being scrutinized by the court, CIA henchmen were effectively running the hearing, openly coaching the British prosecutors. An investigative journalist, we might mention the U.S.-UK involvement on some other issues at this point. As investigative journalist John Pilger wrote, the court was, quote, swarming with U.S. officials, their visible instructions holding sway, close quote. Finally, Barretzer, the judge, rejected a request for a 3-month delay to Assange's full extradition hearing in February. Struggling to speak, Assange stated, quote, "The superpower had 10 years to prepare for this case. I can't access any of my written work. They have an unfair advantage dealing with documents. This is not equitable, what is happening here," close quote. Barretzer, the judge, contemptuously declared that Assange could speak to his lawyers later if he did not understand the proceedings. Neither the judge nor any other representative of the corrupt British judiciary has explained why he is being held in virtual solitary confinement at the maximum security Belmarsh prison, despite the fact his custodial sentence on a bogus bail charge expired in September. The miserable show trial was not covered seriously by any major corporate publication in the world. All of them have sought to cover up what it revealed, that the 9-year U.S. vendetta against Assange has been an illegal political persecution from the outset. Every step of the way, The Guardian, the New York Times, and a host of other corporate outlets have functioned as the adjuncts of the U.S. government in its attempt to destroy the WikiLeaks founder. They incessantly promoted the bogus Swedish investigation into alleged sexual misconduct against Assange, which was the fraudulent basis for his arrest by the British police in 2010, and which forced him to seek asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in June 2012. The well-heeled journalists claimed that Assange was hiding from justice. They covered up the fact that Assange was never charged with a crime in Sweden and that one of the women involved said she'd been railroaded by the police into making a complaint. The corporate journalists derided Assange's insistence that the Swedish allegations were aimed at blackening his name and providing an alternate route for his extradition to the U.S. over WikiLeaks' exposure of American war crimes. All of Assange's warnings have come to pass. The entire pseudo-legal veneer of the campaign against him, including the Swedish frame-up, has been exposed as a fraud. Even before he has been extradited to the U.S., Assange is facing a lawless show trial in Britain. This account is not the account you will hear in the American press, or in the British press either for that matter, but it is a scandal of the first order having to do with the important question of whether the U.S. government is going to be able to censor the accounts you hear of U.S. government war crimes. That's what it's about. You've been listening to News from Neptune. We are in the 43rd week of 2019, a U.S. government censorship and torture edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. J.B. Nicholson's notes are particularly valuable, and we've not gotten to all of them by any means. They will be posted in the Facebook page for News from Neptune and on the emails. The email list.
Peace discuss or peace aware peace list.
I trip on it because peace discuss comes out as peace discussed each time I say it accidentally with a
And
preparing.
some people would support you in that sentiment.
Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.